My next guest from the UK is researcher and author William Stuart. Hello, William, and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jane. It's very nice of you to invited me, and hello to your listeners.
The issue of banking is at the forefront of most people's minds these days, whether it is about the bailouts or the multi-million pounds and dollar bonuses paid to bank executives. More and more people are becoming aware that these banking organizations that hide in the shadows are actually the real puppet masters, pulling our strings and holding the real power in this world. So, how did these people get into such a position of power?
Well, I've been researching for a very long time, roughly for 10 years, and I went back in history and then back in history and back in history again until back in the 7th century. What I found there was an Italian bank in Venice, which we call the Fondo, and the members of the bank are called the Fondi. And I looked at that bank and realized that, it was a central bank. It was something that was affecting a huge region and was a place of considerable wealth and considerable corruption. And look at the banking they were doing. They had arranged themselves into teams slaving in the Eastern Mediterranean, looting from various countries, manipulating currencies, and had got themselves organized in 697 AD with 12 leaders and one central leader called the Doge or Duke of Venice. And that is the system that I began to look at with considerable interest. They purchased the island of St. George, and that became Venice. And the bank became the Basilica of St. George in Venice.
You're saying that these early bankers obtained some of their income from looting, slaving, and general criminal activities. That all sounds familiar.
Well, yes, they did. They were not, in any sense, Christians, were not adopted any of that movement, but were based in the occult, which they enjoyed very much, as they enjoyed their slaving into the Eastern Mediterranean. And they are found in history attacking various parts of Europe into 700s, 800s, and 900s. And the first Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne called them the Mediterranean Vikings in 800 AD, and he said that they were a threat to Europe, which eventually they were going to turn out to be. So, yes, you've got a central bank which then obtains its gold and its wealth by any possible means.
What is the next stage in this journey?
Well, the next bit that we can clearly identify is the Knights Templar, and people often wonder what happened to the Knights Templar, and if you read my book you will find that out. Basically, the Knights Templar were going to enter the Mediterranean region and free Jerusalem for pilgrims, but unfortunately these Mediterranean Vikings were there right at the beginning, the foundation of the Templars, and actually took them over. And these bankers, in fact, provided all the transport, the ships for the Knights Templar, and gradually caused the whole movement to become an occult structure based upon something called the Order of Zion. And the reason this is important to us is not just that the Crusades largely supported the Lombard Empire in the Eastern Mediterranean. So the Lombards then in 1150 AD used the Knights Templar to set up lodges throughout Britain and Europe.
What exactly were these lodges and what was their purpose?
Well, the lodges were what we might today call Red Masonry. We don't want to call it Freemasonry because it certainly isn't that. And the purpose of them was to set up a structure across Europe and across Britain. So you had the first four lodges, one in Stockholm, one in Naples, one in Paris, and one in Edinburgh. And from these lodges they began to subvert the financial structures of both Europe and of Britain. And the situation over 200 years, that is from around 1150 to 1340, became so severe that all the nations were bankrupt, and the kings of all these nations, plus the Pope, got together and began a campaign of removing the Lombards in their first invasion of Europe. And the Lombards were driven back to Venice, where they were controlled and contained by a number of nations acting together. But it's worth us noting what happened, because this is banking, but it's also a radical form of counterculture that starts to destroy the basis of a nation, alters its thinking, alters its finances, its politics, its education, and its religion. So we begin to see in this invasion, 200-year invasion, an absolute catastrophe for the financial world. And if that doesn't ring bells for us, it really ought to, because we can go on and trace this process a little bit further.
So, are you actually saying that England itself was bankrupt during this 200-year period?
Yes, it was completely bankrupt, and interest rates were running at about 800%, if you can imagine that. It's very difficult to imagine it, but that's how bad it was. And the King of England simply defaulted on his loans, and then they all got together and said, "Well, we really got to go and do something about this because we're being driven into a state of complete chaos." And then they all acted together with, I might say, the church as well. The Roman Church joined in and helped provide leadership to remove these people from our nation.
So, after these Lombard banking families were driven back to Venice, what happened to them then?
Well, Jane, over a period of time, they managed to escape from this particular prison that had been set for them. But it did take time, and so did removing them from Europe. You're talking of almost 100 years of activity, trying to clear up the banks and trying to clear up the currencies and problems that had resulted. But somewhere in the region of 1500, because we know that they were in Geneva in 1500, they moved, not necessarily moving the entire central bank, Fondo Bank, but they moved and set up a branch in Geneva. So that when they then began to approach nations again, this time round, they could be seen as different people with a different cause. And so from the 1500s, they began to work on England in particular, and this time not on Europe in general. They were really beginning to concentrate on England. And they looked for an opportunity to enter our country and use the marriage problems of Henry VIII to do so. Their agents gave advice to Henry VIII, supported him, and eventually brought about what we call the Reformation and the attack on the monasteries. All of that was Lombard in nature.
Well, the reign of Henry VIII certainly produced some interesting and turbulent times in English history.
They produced the most extraordinary times, and one can think of Henry as loyal to Britain, but at the same time there were very profound political issues going on behind the scenes. So when we talk about Martin Luther and think about the Reformation coming through him, we have to remember that his companion was Contarini, who was one of the main leaders of the Fondo of St. Mark's Basilica in Venice. And what happened during that period was not entirely straightforward. The Lombards were firmly involved in the loss of the monasteries, and in fact, when the Lombards came to power in Italy, the first thing they did was to break up all the monasteries. So there was a sort of repetition in the events of the Reformation. It was a very sad time and a very confusing time, and it's good that out of it came a reasonable church and a settled nation, but it was a very disturbing period of history.
Well, Elizabeth I followed her father Henry VIII. So, what happened to the Lombards during her reign?
Well, it appears that they had got their feet under the table during the reign of Henry, and they created what we now call the British East India Company, and that was their first huge step forward. And this company meant tremendous growth around the world, and eventually the company controlled the lives of about a fifth of the world's population. So what we see in the reign of Elizabeth I, and again she was very loyal to our country, but nevertheless this system had got somehow under the surface of everything. And we see the East India Company emerging, and with that comes the takeover of the British establishment, the control of our armed forces, the control through intelligence services which were run from Switzerland, from Geneva, the Royal Society, which came directly from this Lombard period, control of the banks, and then an attempted control of the monarchy. So if we take the banks first of all, we now have a Bank of England which has been a tremendous servant to the nation. That doesn't stop us saying, however, that when it began, it was founded by the Lombards. They moved their banking arrangements to Geneva, then to Holland, and then across the Channel to England. And when the bank was opened, it was opened by 7 bankers, which is quite significant in some ways because we'll mention that again. They introduced into our country the first issues of paper money, and with that came a national debt. So in 4 years the debt rose from 1.6 million to approximately 16 million, which of course in those days was pretty disastrous. So what we begin to see is the gradual takeover of the nation, and it's worth knowing that these bankers, just like ivy creeps somewhere, found their way into just about every aspect of the nation, including into the big houses and into society in general.
Going back to the East India Company, many people think of this as a Victorian setup, but you're saying that it actually goes back to Elizabeth I. So, can you fill us in on the origins of this organisation?
Well, yes, I can. We're talking about a financial invasion of just about everything you can think about, from banks to royalty to everything. In 1581, the Venetian Turkey Company was prospering overseas, and this merged and became the Levant Company, which later became the infamous British East India Company in 1600. The first governor of the East India Company was Thomas Smythe, who was trained in Venice and studied law in Padua. In short, he was a Venetian agent, and the East India Company was only an extension of the Levant Empire.
So, was our military used to gain land and assets for the East India Company rather than actually serving the national interest?
Well, the East India Company was allowed to produce its own army and navy, and did so, and the result was an army and navy rather larger than the one that belonged to Britain. But just as there were many very good people attached to the British East India Company and many loyal people, so this subversion went right the way through into the Foreign Office, which they largely controlled, as I say, into the intelligence services. So yes, effectively, we had an army and a navy that was working for the bankers who enjoyed looting and slaving and opium dealing, and we're not really dealing with anything very honourable.
Oh, this sounds like rather a familiar story and one that's being repeated right now. So, presumably, the Bank of England was all part of this picture.
Yes, it was. As we've seen, the East India Company was being run from Geneva by shareholders, and eventually a few Freemasons in Britain joined that particular club, but in fact it was Lombard in every way. And the Bank of England, we might say, was founded directly from the Fondo of Venice via Holland, and it was not a good bank when it began its life. Paper currency was brought to us, and with that came the usual inflation, war, which it was prepared to pay for, and the debts that resulted from that. The bank was first under the Venetian Charles Montague, and along with the foundation of the Bank of England came the Bank of Amsterdam, Hamburg, and Sweden. But of course, all of these banks were basically the result of the Fondo of Venice. In 1773, the Bank of England foreign shareholders helped to cause the War of Independence, attacking the finances of America. So we know what we're dealing with. We're dealing with the same old central banking structure of Italy. 7 men formed the bank and insisted on having paper money, headed by somebody called William Paterson. And as I said just earlier, the Treasury debts rose from 1.25 million into about 16 million in a very short period of time. These bankers had the right to form the Bank of England, and they allowed 10 paper pounds for every pound value metal. So you've got this system of inflation and creep right from the start. And they allowed the taxpayer really to recover all the loans that they made. So there's a very familiar kind of ring going on about what subsequently happened in America and then in Europe. They made a 50% profit on loans of only 5%, so you can see a rampant system being developed which caused our nation dear. In 1771, the foreign shareholders, as I said, influenced the behaviour of the bank, so you've got the bank beginning to interfere in people's countries and causing wars. Now, what we have to say over a period of time is that it was the establishment in Britain, all of it, virtually all of it, that was infected by this invasion. And so when the clear-up came, Britain had a new nation. And although from outside, looking in on Britain, you like to say that over this period of time, that Britain itself was the cause and the corruption. In fact, all of this came from outside the nation. So as we began to reform our nation, down to things like slavery and opium dealing and all the other things that happened through the East India, so the bank was reformed, and one often hears today that the Bank of England is corrupt, but what one can really say is you have to look back at what happened, and you see that the majority of those conditions vanished away over time. So we had a Bank of England that was then held in to the British government, and that was a measure of control over the bank that was very, very necessary and took it away from private shareholders.
There are a lot of campaigners who think that the Bank of England should be abolished. Now, what are your views on this?
Well, my personal view is that the Bank of England is serving our nation extremely well, and were it not for the Bank of England and its activities, we could be and would be in a very, very serious financial position today. So I think with all of the British establishment, which must include the Bank of England, one has to look very, very carefully at something which does serve the nation extremely well, which has changed its nature, and try to be objective about what one finds there. I know there's controversy because people would, for instance, would like to know who the shareholders are, and that information has never been given out. Now, things like that people would like to know about their own bank. But that said, it was a very, very corrupt bank when it was formed, and is now, I think, doing rather a good job for the nation.
Well, maybe the shareholders are actually the Rothschilds or the Rockefellers.
Well, I think you make a point, and we simply don't know. And what I've said is I think we really ought to know who the shareholders are in the Bank of England. And I also think that the reforms which have taken the Bank of England a little bit away from the government and made it more independent are a grievous mistake.
Let's go over to the States now and talk about the Federal Reserve. An increasing number of Americans are now realizing that it is a corrupt organization and was definitely not set up to benefit the American people.
Well, that is correct, and it's worth just making a few little comments about the Federal Reserve System. We started off in Venice with 12 apostles, they were called, and the Doge of Venice making up the structure of the central bank. A substructure within that was 7 men who were called the 7 wise governors. And it's quite interesting that as the Bank of England is formed, so it turns out to be what are called the 7 immortals, or the 7 men who stepped forward to create this, what at that time was a ferocious bank. In America, when it comes to the Federal Reserve System, 7 men joined together to create the Federal Reserve System at Jekyll Island. So we've got 7 bankers. And they represented roughly a quarter of the wealth of the entire world, we are told. Federal Reserve systems are such that the American worker today earns about 30% less than he did in 1973. After tax and 2 paychecks, the income is not equal to a single income of 30 years ago. One of the bankers concerned, in this case Rockefeller, claimed that the equality movement, bringing, of course, employment to most women, had been created by the bankers for the very simple reason that they wished to create the pool of taxes that go to them and go to the Federal Reserve System. 40% of the money generated by American workers, 40% of taxation, that is, pays off the Federal Reserve debt on a continual basis. So that is why, when you look at the Federal Reserve System, you begin to see America in trouble. The way they started to fund America was quite simple. The 7 men said to the American government, "Would you like several million?" And the American government said, "Yes, we would." And so they simply printed money, and that was that. No gold or silver changed hands, just simply the printing of money. And then it was left to the American taxpayer to pay back the debt plus a large amount of interest. And you'll note that in this system of the Federal Reserve System, they can just alter the interest rates as and when they want. So there are inexplicable changes in interest rates which are obviously very beneficial for those who do it. In 1910, the 7 bankers met in secret on Jekyll Island using only first names and steered through this whole process, which came to power in 1913. The bank is like Lombard's, and it's quite interesting to say that the Federal Reserve System is run from Geneva, and all the people who make up its shareholders are foreigners. So the bank, it doesn't even belong to America anyway. Geneva, of course, is the home of the United Nations, which was formed by the same bankers, International Monetary Fund, World Trade Organization, and Bank of International Settlements. And we'll come on to the Bank of International Settlements, but that was actually founded under the surface by J.P. Morgan Banking and all the allied bankers attached to him. So was the Federal Reserve System. So you begin to see what is emerging. The first governor of the bank was Paul Warburg, and I believe that you will find his ancestry in Venice, the origin of that family, Abraham del Banco. Of the banking families running the Federal Reserve System, and this, I believe, was the situation, and may be the situation, is Rothschild of London, Rothschild of Berlin, Lazard Frère of Paris, Safe of Italy, Kung Loeb of Germany, and Sachs, with influences from the Rockefellers too. So that is basically the bank that is running America. This bank can simply create inflation and depression when it wants to, and it can dictate, I suppose, USA policy, because it is the source of the most monumental debts. And one of the things that Americans might like to find out, and can't find out at the moment, is exactly the size of these debts. One very good article recently and talk that I heard made the point from America, so we're not talking to America but simply learning quite a lot from them. This remark about the Federal Reserve went as follows: the Federal Reserve is incapable of accomplishing the stated objectives. It is a cartel operating against the public interest. It's a supreme instrument of usury. It generates our most unfair tax. It encourages war, and it destabilizes the economy. Now, the creator of this bank was J.P. Morgan. We talk about a company rather than a person, I think, here. But you know that he generated deliberately the stock market crash of 1929. So that is the founder working with other bankers of the Federal Reserve System. In America, one of the agents, in this case Rothschild agents, when this stock market crash took place, was called Bernard Baruch, and he converted all his shares and everything, stocks, the lot, into silver coinage before the crash came. So you're beginning to see in America a problem which I think is probably quite significant. When you want to get to the basis of the problem in America, I'm going to say it is the Federal Reserve System.
Whilst we're on the subject of the United States, wasn't the War of Independence instigated by the Bank of England?
Well, that's a very, very interesting question, and of course our history is rewritten by something called the Round Table, and so one has to go back to roots to begin to look at this. The Bank of England, in fact, started to interfere with the American currency and the rights that Americans had previously enjoyed. And so we are actually beginning to look at the Lombard Bank of England, not the present Bank of England, through its foreign shareholders, and they were all foreign and are at that stage at least listed. It began the aggression against America. Now, you might think that the War of Independence was a war between Britain and America. It most certainly was not. Britain was still suffering from a Lombard invasion, and the independence that was to come, the Lombards hoped, would be the acquisition of America, its raw materials, its banks, and so much more. Masonry, or Red Masonry I think we might call it, in the American War of Independence, the lodges in Boston were all generated from Switzerland with money coming in to cause the war, so we're talking about Geneva now. The type of masonry I've looked at which caused the War of Independence is Swiss masonry, and I have actually traced the origin of the aggression against America to the Seven Sisters Lodge in Paris, where Benjamin Franklin used to hang out with Voltaire and Venetian agents. I've also traced that through to the Hellfire Clubs in Britain, where the espionage was set up which undermined the British Navy and the British Army. So that putting these together, actually they're in my book, but the war between America and Britain didn't really occur in that way at all, and there were people under the surface, bankers under the surface, who were intent upon changing the nature of America, and they still are, because they're still after the Constitution. It's also true to say, and again I've mapped this out in some detail in the book, that the American Civil War had very little to do with Americans falling out with each other. The Lombard agents were on both sides of that war and instigated it from start to finish. It didn't just happen. And I have traced the process whereby this occurred. I can tell you that B'nai B'rith, which is a secret organisation, Red Masonry, the Young Movement, these groups underneath the surface, which are all Lombard in origin, caused that war, and I've got the process in the book. It's just worth saying in passing that the same lodges that I've just talked about were established in the Middle East at about the same time as the American Civil War, and that led on to something which we know about, which is called the Muslim Brotherhood.
So what do you think has emerged as a result of the Civil War?
When we look closely at the Civil War, we do find that Rothschild agents are working in the south of the country, Astor agents are working in the north of the country, and these two gentlemen were to found the Round Table, which we might call Fabian Society Round Table, which went on to become the Council of Foreign Relations, Bilderberg and Trilaterate Commission. But going back into those days, there was also an undercurrent of Swiss masonry working away under the surface in the Civil War, and Swiss finance. So what you find as a result of the Civil War was that the banker is becoming really quite dominant as a theme. And when President Lincoln started to print patriotic money, trying to avoid getting involved with European bankers, he was shot dead. I don't have too many questions about who did it and why they did it, which later on may bring us on to President Kennedy.
Is there another stage in this banking agenda that brings it into a more global arena?
Well, that's a good question because, yes, there is actually. J.P. Morgan and his Secret Seven formed the Federal Reserve System, and J.P. Morgan also formed the Bank of International Settlements, hiding obviously behind various people, but it was J.P. Morgan, all right, and that took us back in link to the European bankers who are in league with the American bankers. One of the things the Bank of International Settlements was designed for, we were told, was war reparations. And it is true to say that they paid the Allies 86 billion over a period of time. However, Germany borrowed from the Bank of International Settlements £138 billion. This resulted in the formation of the Third Reich. The world wars that we've had, when you look at them, are very straightforward. World War One bankers are known, who were behind the breakup of the Ottoman Empire and all that occurred, bringing in World War One. They profited from that war, and then later on at Versailles they arranged World War Two. Now this is in the book. World War Two was in fact paid for and organised and structured from 120 to 140 Broadway, New York. So what you've got in the Bank of International Settlements is the hiring of Hitler, the paying of Hitler, the funding of the Third Reich, and the bank was formed in 1930 and went straight at forming the Third Reich. And then the link up with American industry, American with a small a because we're dealing with the same Lombard influences, the supply to the Third Reich of aircraft parts, vehicles, fuel throughout the whole of the war, and so on and so forth. So we've got an international bank, as well as finding 138 billion for Hitler and knowing what would happen anyway. They knew exactly what was going to happen because they planned it. But having done that, they also provided Swiss gold for Hitler just to make sure that there was enough money in the pot. The Dawes and Young arrangements actually go back simply to J.P. Morgan. And in the Dawes and Young plan, which was basically war reparations, but it turned out not to be the same thing at all, was Fritz Thyssen, who equipped the Nazi Party in conjunction, as I said, with Broadway. And one or two of the names like Avril Harriman and Prescott Bush will be known to people that worked with Fritz Thyssen, making sure that Hitler came not only to power, but to dominant power in Europe. We have to say of the Bank of International Settlements, because we are simply dealing with something that needs evaluating, that after the outbreak of World War II, it was the Bank of International Settlements that took into its vaults the stolen gold from all over Europe. Eventually, after a lot of comment and action, they released and gave back a mere £4 million, but they took into their coffers the gold of Europe. This included 44 assignments of gold from Auschwitz, where they knowingly melted down the gold teeth of the Jews and spectacles and cigarette cases and the like. The people concerned in doing that were later employed by the Rockefeller interests in America. So the Bank of International Settlements went straight in, really, to become a criminal endeavour. What happened after World War II, the Bretton Woods Conference, was that the American president and many others and other countries said that the Bank of International Settlements would be closed at once for war crimes. By whatever process of international law, the people running the Bank of International Settlements ensured that they could not be got at by the law of any nation. So they remained above anything that could be done to them personally. And although it was decided by all the nations that the BIS would close, in fact, as you know, it didn't close. It just kept its head down and kept going, and now is in a dominant position organising the structures of the G7.
So why was nobody able to touch the Bank of International Settlements after World War II, when the evidence against them was so obviously damning?
Well, because the bank has got to the international law before anybody else. What I can tell you about the Bank of International Settlements is that it was founded as a private organisation. It's privately owned. It was founded by questionable people, which will include the J.P. Morgan arrangements. It accounts to absolutely nobody. Its books are closed. It operates secretly, and it is inviolate. It is above the law and beyond prosecution. Its money movements are in fact hidden, so once you get into international markets you can't tell what it's doing with the money, although you can be sure it's profiting. It does still target regional currencies, and it is the agent looking to global currency. Now, when you say, how did they achieve this? They achieved it simply by international law. One of the things that I've said in my book is that national law must begin to override international law. We've got to begin to get back moral governments, moral nations, and be able to act as free and reasonable and decent people again.
So what is the present arrangements with the Bank of International Settlements?
Well, in 2003, the Bank of International Settlements abandoned the gold Swiss franc, which it has had underpinning its activities since 1930, and it developed a paper system, can you believe, called special drawing rights. It's based really upon currencies such as the yen, the pound and the dollar, but gold no longer backs currencies. Central banks are private. So this is a sort of step towards an international paper currency. We've already seen how that paper currency has affected the world. We've seen how it affected the Bank of England to start with. Now we're beginning to look at a world paper currency, again founded by questionable people. And the problem with this paper currency is that nations that are linked to this system can simply start printing paper money. And so from 2003 onward, we are faced with a new form of currency, which I think is extremely unhealthy. And people like the Conservative Party in Britain, who are busy ensuring that Britain doesn't get involved in the euro, for very good reason, are suddenly going to find that somebody stepped around behind them and produced special drawing rights, the new currency for the whole globe. There's no doubt about it that they're really trying to create now a world currency with world implications for anybody who gets caught up in it.
We've talked about individual banks, but is there some way that we can define the movement?
Well, yes, we can, and some of what I have to say may be a little surprising, but nevertheless, I have done my research. This group in the Eastern Mediterranean, where it all began, was actually involved in banking and in trading with sword in hand, so there's a war-making side to it. And they were prepared to get involved in anything from looting to opium dealing. Actually, you're beginning to look at a group of people who are diametrically opposed to Christianity. They didn't like the Holy Roman Empire, and they didn't like Christians. They didn't care for Jews either, and that, again, is another story. So begins a group which moves up into Europe, bringing with it much the same kind of baggage. So what they do is they plan 120 years before they act, so that when an event occurs, the people who planned it are already dead. And as you know, it's rather difficult to arrest anybody who's been dead for that long, and that's how they operate. When they close in on a nation, they start to unpick the education. Remember Karl Marx, but he was run by very rich people. Finance, which of course we've talked about in broad outline, knowing what they want, which is a world currency. Religion, because they operate in an occult way through occult red masonry, and therefore they have a vested interest in ensuring that religion is removed. And politics, which they can often move to the extreme right, which then results in a war which they have caused, and invariably they will be on both sides. So we're dealing with a structure which has remained, first of all, hidden by the cunning and deceit that it practices, and secondly, which has been written out of history by the Round Table. If you were to take an example of that, Lord Shelburne of Bowood in the 18th century, he actually caused the French Revolution. He did it on behalf of the Lombard bankers, and the stories of the French Revolution ever since have been nonsense. He rewrote history. And then you move on another couple of hundred years, you've got a Mr. Beer, who was employed specifically to write out of history the American War of Independence and the Civil War and much else besides. So you've got a group which will quietly move in on a country, and suddenly you'll find a deterioration. The actual occult groups they've got are based upon something called the Eleusinian mystery religion, which came from 15 BC Athens, was adopted first by the Romans and then by these Lombards as a secret trading base, so they could set up this seemingly religious group in any country they wanted, but it would of course be serving them, and its inner workings are pagan and occult. So when you get the occult showing in a particular country, you find the church having a difficult time, you may be sure that the presence of the Lombard has returned, as it has frequently done so in history.
So can you say more about the occult?
Well, yes, I can. We go back to 15 BC, and there is the Eleusinian mystery religion. And that religion is quite likely to follow any of the pagan gods, so you don't actually have to pin it down too closely. And this was a very precious instrument of trade, because wherever you put it, you could trade from that base, but also it was a secret society, and therefore much of what you did could be excluded from public view. And the Lombards took on this system with huge enthusiasm, and wherever they went, they took with them the Eleusinian mystery religion. Now, I can point to various little bits of our history, and you will find the EMR being mentioned. Now, for instance, the Nine Sisters Lodge in Paris, which has had quite an effect on causing wars, is based on the EMR. The Hellfire Clubs, which instigated the War of Independence, are based upon the EMR. And this EMR then became the agent that polluted the Knights Templar. As I said, the Knights Templar were employed by the Lombard bankers. So now you've got the EMR inside the Templars, who then assist the Lombards to increase their empire in the Eastern Mediterranean and then invade Britain through the four lodges that I've talked about. So you've got EMR lodges, Templar lodges, right inside a growing democracy and within a Christian nation. So now you begin to play with words, and you could use the word Templar, you could use the word Rosicrucian, you can use the word EMR, all to explain exactly the same thing. And if you look at the 6 wars that I have described, you will find that Templar Red Masonry is the agency being used to disrupt countries under the surface. You can move on a little bit from this broad occultism to see it linking with lesser groups and smaller groups in the community and encouraging them to be occult, because this is really basically the Lombard process. But I have defined the rites and the processes whereby Red Masonry is used as a support for the banking movement. And basically, most Freemasons are in the blue degrees, the first 3 degrees, but this system operates in the higher Templar degrees. I do assure you that the central column of the banking movement has, since 697 AD, had a very firm occult and pagan group attached to it. One of the central groups that belong to this banking system is called the Fratres Lucis, or the Brotherhood of Light. Other people over the ages have called it the Illuminati, and they don't know what the Illuminati is. But Fratres Lucis has always belonged firmly to the Lombard cause and to the East India Company, and it is basically the EMR secret society. It is very distinctive because it objected to St. John of Patmos, who wrote the Book of Revelation, against the powers and principalities of this world, against Babylon and Rome. And so what they did was to basically use the letters of St. John to the 7 churches in Asia and use it as their title. So the second title for the Fratres Lucis is the 7 churches of Asia. What I can tell you is that anybody who joins the Fratres Lucis, although they're probably going to join Masonry and then get siphoned off into the Fratres Lucis, will be initiated using the words from the Book of Revelation. When the East India Company was at its height of power, they called it the John Company. Moving on from that, they've got a form of Masonry attached to the Fratres Lucis, which is called Armageddon Masonry. And what that has done is to plan 6 wars. Actually, they've planned 7, but they've had 6. And so part of the book is to define this progress of the Lombards through finance and through aggression in their conquest of what I think we might call the free world. And it's been done to a very specific plan. Around 1711, they had worked out, roughly speaking, the 7 wars that they were going to have. We've had 6. Although it sounds unlikely, and people are going to say, well, I can't really believe that, just look up the Freemasons Dictionary by A.E. Waite.
You've talked about 7 wars. We've already had 6, so are you saying that there is another war in the planning?
Yes, I am saying just that. If you want to talk about the wars, the first one was the War of Independence, in which the Templar lodges played the major part. The second one was the French Revolution, which was dominated by Templar lodges. The third one was the American Civil War, which was dominated by Templar lodges. The fourth one was World War I, along with the Russian Revolution. That leaves 1 war left. Now, Red Masonry and its various structures played a significant part in both the Russian Revolution and in World War II. This leaves us with thoughts about Armageddon Masonry, which is very real, and therefore in the Book of Revelation you have 7 wars, and so they have planned to bring about their wars in 7 phases. I've said that they plan roughly 120 years ahead of acting. So what I can tell you is that if you go back to 1881, you will then find a significant pool of activity preparing for war in the Middle East. What you then do is add the 120 years to 1881, and you end up with 2001, and for reasons that I've gone into later on with September the 11th. The planning for a war in the Middle East is very, very complicated, it's very clever, and the planning went on, as I say, over that span of time. What I would point to is how very dangerous this undercover, underhand bankers arrangement is. People have gone to sleep, and they have forgotten perhaps that we are safe simply because of eternal vigilance.
So how does the European Union fit in with all this?
Well, the European Union was planned in secret in Canada in 1942. The bankers who met to discuss the European Union were directly related to those who paid for the Russian Revolution and were involved in other wars. So in 1942, the bankers who had bankrolled Hitler moved rapidly out of the way and abandoned him and began to plan for their future during the peace years. We talk about something like the Maastricht Treaty or something like that in the 1990s as the doorways through into Europe, but we need to know that it is based upon the Ventotene Manifesto, which was produced by the Italians in 1941-42 in secret. So when we're dealing with the European Union, we're dealing with yet one more step into a society that is controlled by bankers and run by bankers and has very little to do with human freedom, dignity and liberty. The European Union itself, in a sort of slightly longer origin, was produced by a Lombard agent called Giuseppe Mazzini in 1837. So you've got to add 120 years to that to find that the European process is opened up in 1957. 1837 we had Giovine Europa, which was the idea of the United States of Europe, which was also called for in 1849 by the Knights Templar Order of Zan leader, Grand Master Victor Hugo. What we've seen with the European Union is something that is akin very closely to the East India Company. When it traded in India, it made people pay into the system, and by paying into the system, the East India got very rich and didn't do anything, and then the payers were allowed to trade. So what you've got in the European Union is something remarkably similar to something we've seen before. Over a period of time, very sadly, we've seen our laws being eroded by the power that was in Europe before it moved to Canada in 1942. We've seen the freedom of our voting system moved into some sort of corporate voting arrangement. So I believe that in Europe we've seen the growth of the old oligarchy. One of the weapons in their armoury is a thing called synarchy. And synarchy has appeared before the French Revolution, in the French Revolution, throughout the process of World War. And another word for it is Nazi communism. And what happens with the process of synarchy is that you get a very right-wing arrangement that runs a left-wing commune. So synarchy is what really is happening at the moment to the free world. We are manoeuvring into control by bankers, but the people who are caught up in this are to be no more than peasants in a commune. And I can trace this synarchy movement as a very, very powerful movement through Europe into America, and in association with what are called the hawks in America of recent times. So synarchy is a very real thing. The bankers, particularly in America, and I'm thinking of one or two of them, I would think of Rockefeller, for instance, who repeatedly backs communism and says what a good thing communism is, whilst at the same time enjoying remarkable riches. What is happening in the sowing of socialism and communism and the left wing is simply the formation of a peasant commune. So if you look at the Reece Committee of Congress, who investigated education in America, they came up with the startling conclusion that religion was being removed. And remember, I talked about religion as one of the 4 points. And socialism, a form of socialism, is being introduced into the schools by the various trusts concerned. So you see, what we're being prepared for is a left-right commune. If you listen to the Ford Foundation, they stated quite clearly that what they intended to do was unite America, minus its constitution, with Russia in Europe, which, bearing in mind, is, from my point of view, a Lombard concern, as part of the process of then moving on to greater things in greater parts of the world. So you've got the left wing and you've got the right wing. And if you want to look at the foundation of something like the United Nations, you'll find that the founder, John Dulles, who is part of the banking ring, was an extreme right-wing leader, a real extremist who believed in a super race and eugenics, and he created an entirely communist committee for the United Nations. By looking at this and studying it, you begin to discover that there is an actual process going on which is gathering pace, and that is that when we go to sleep, and if we sleep for too long, we will emerge in a society which is very right-wing, as with the Third Reich, in which the rights of the people are curtailed to the point of really left-wing peasantry. And that is the process that we're also going through at the present time. When people talk about the New World Order, it's a lot nastier than they think it is.
There are many trends that just seem to take hold. Is there any way they have of altering our society or our perceptions of things?
Well, yes, indeed. And I think I should say that the first point is the Council of Foreign Relations, which is really the round table which came out of the Treaty of Versailles, tends to recruit the top echelon of leadership in the United States of America. And it was started by the Rockefeller bankers and other bankers allied to him, of course. So you've got a huge pressure group in America which doesn't like sovereignty, I suspect doesn't like the Constitution too much, and is constantly crying for New World Order. You've also got an offshoot of that which is called the Bilderberg Group, which is founded by exactly the same people. the same bankers. And that is pushing out policies for the European dimension, the European Union, and is a link to round-table trading of one sort and another. And that in turn has also produced the Trilateral Commission, which again is Rockefeller's Brzezinski, and the Trilateral Commission has been extremely active in the Middle East in a variety of ways, for instance, removing the Shah of Iran and so on and so forth. So certainly you've got these secret groups which are being allowed to function, which are tending to shape both our policies, political situations and trading. Then there's another whole section that does affect us. We talk first of all about functionalism. Functionalism takes a nation, let us say Britain, and divides it into four. So instead of having a powerful Westminster government, it will have something running Scotland, Ireland, England and Wales. Functionalism starts to break up the pattern of a nation and substitutes regions. Some of these regions are quite big and some of them are quite small. So there is functionalism. Its main centre is Bellagio in Italy, and that was given by a banker or banker's widow to the Rockefellers. We've got the Green Movement, which was plugged very powerfully by the BBC, much to my annoyance. The Green Movement, in fact, is a hoax created by the Club of Rome, which is another branch of what we're talking about. It is supported from Holland by Bilderberg members, and it has evaded the issue of ice ages and all the things that have profoundly altered our climate since the beginning of time, and has tried to suggest that CO2 create temperature changes. The Green Movement, in design, is to prevent, or an attempt to prevent, the development of America economically and of Britain economically, to take the raw materials and resources from Africa by dumbing down their development and insisting on green policies, and it is in support of their investments in China and in India, where lots of black smoke follows the money trail. I've written at length on the Green Movement simply to show that it is an absolute hoax. The propaganda from the bankers is such that you would think the Green Movement has, this is man-made global warming we're really talking about, has a huge following. In fact, it doesn't. The vast majority of scientists have already said that it is a fraud and a deliberate one. And there we've had a period of history where we've actually been encouraged to abandon Britain's industrial revolution and Britain's movement of manufacture into an era where there'll be no oil. So basically we're being seriously affected by the Green Movement in a way that we don't even think is happening. But the people have lost the idea of fighting for industry, getting our industries going, getting industrial revolution going, and then providing the schools and the hospitals that we really want to see. So that's the Green Movement is very sinister, but I can tell you that it comes from the Club of Rome. Then there's the Frankfurt Movement, which began in 1942 roughly, but began to bite very hard in 1945. What this movement does is to separate, or try to separate, children from their parents, the attitude of children from parental obedience to disobedience. It inspires immorality of every possible kind. It disturbs the relationship between men and women. It is basically an undermining process that was directly behind the hippie movement and is directly behind what we might call radical counterculture, where the structure of the nation is being eroded. Frankfurt is a very manipulative process that was also used to promote the Cold War in Europe, the East-West divide which you now see being placed into the Middle East. So Frankfurt is not a pleasant thing. It first manifested itself out of the OSS and CIA in America, took over the European wing of the CIA and began to work its tricks both on Britain and on Europe. There's also, of course, socialism itself, but that's really political. It's trying to head us into becoming an obedient socialist commune. And the roots of socialism can be traced back to Venetian agents talking now of the Darwinian period and what is called Darwinian socialism, because the Lombards also produced Darwin's theory of evolution. There are then other groups operating, and one of them is Common Purpose, which has infiltrated many of the groups and establishments in this country. We are told that it's in the BBC and the police and so on and so forth. There are supposed to be a large number of recruits who basically are working beyond authority, which means that they are networking outside the groups that we normally depend upon and may start twisting planning and all sorts of other things to their own advantage, including linking up with functionalism, which means a disintegrating country being placed into the hands of a foreign power. Common purpose is also called Marburg in the United States of America, and Marburg came from the Carnegie organization. So they're the same process. And I've already talked a little bit about Synergy, but Synergy is also the same process as Marburg and Common Purpose. So you'll see that we've got these various groups acting both separately and also together to bring about changes. So if you go abroad and you stay abroad for a long time, perhaps you work overseas or something like that for 3 years, you come back, you'll suddenly think, my goodness, things have changed. You don't see it happening as it's happening, but you can see it by stepping out of the situation and then stepping back into it again. And the result of all these organisations is that we are beginning to lose not only our sovereignty, but also our direction as a people.
Okay, so we've talked about the problems, so let's now talk about the solutions.
The solutions really begin with trying to see democracy, moral democracy, as the aim and goal that each individual and family should have, as opposed to oligarchy. Oligarchy is the rule by the few, democracy is the rule by the many. So when we begin to look at the, I think, very significant problems that are developing around the world and begin to find the same people, the same small group, underneath so many things that are happening, we have to begin to think about rebuilding democracy. There are some key points that we need to keep in mind. The first is the internet, which is bringing forth information which previously wouldn't have been discovered, wouldn't have been found. We need to be continually working on the internet, bringing these issues to light and communicating with each other, so that the main weapon that the Lombard has, which is secrecy, is eroded and broken. So that's the first thing that we can all do and should be doing. The second thing is to begin to look at our countries and our politicians, working out whether they are being influenced by something and who they are, and also looking for the restoration of democracy by the people's right, votes, referenda. To give you an example, one notable politician was recently heard saying that we would not be having a vote on the European Union because he thought it was beneficial for us. He has forgotten, I think, the fact that he was voted into power and that people have opinions, and it is high time for two things to happen. First of all, education about the European Union, where it came from, who's behind it, and secondly, a vote for our nation. So we're beginning to look at the sort of secrecy that is just oozing out of the beams at the moment. Why are we allowing the secrecy in our communities and the secret societies, the secret red masonry, the Bilderbergs? Why do we allow this to happen in a democracy? And we have questions there for our political class. One of the unfortunate things that's happened is that our laws are being subverted by hidden people in hidden places, thinking particularly of the European Union, but other countries have their problems, and there's a great fear in America that the Constitution is being eroded as well as the people's freedom. So we need to look at that. We must begin to look at the way even our laws are being subverted by some kind of international process. You might find a politician goes to Europe and comes back and saying, well, it's all signed in blood, and we can't do anything about it because it's the law of whoever the law now belongs to. But what we need to do is to bring back the sovereignty of nation and the sovereignty of our law. And that means that national law has to be more important than international law. And that law in our own country needs to belong to the people as their possession and right. So there's a huge change needed to stop this growth of what is called internationalism, but by now you will know that it is Lombard greed where it is heading. The next issue, of course, is the safety of banking, and we hear various soundbites about how much has been done to make banking safe, and yet I have described the Bank of International Settlements, and the G7, 8 or whoever it may now be, is very much linked into those kind of systems. So we need to see British banks which are totally independent of international banking, which are protected against internationalists, which build up assets properly so that we know what they are, and which gets the ratio between precious assets like gold and silver to the paper money ratio correct and stable. At the moment, we're being driven in exactly the opposite direction, which is to move from the collapse of paper money systems into the SDR world paper system. And those who are currently in politics telling us that we're not going into the euro haven't told us the rest of the story, that we'll soon find ourselves under special drawing rights. So there are two very important things. The first is the law and the way that that needs to be brought under control, and the second is the banking, which also needs to be brought under control. Around both these issues is the right of people to know things, to know where things have come from, to have a voice that is heard, and to have a vote. So there are things to head for in the restoration of democracy to stop the creep of oligarchy. And the next thing that we all have to be aware of and have to be on our toes about is the erosion of religion, of education, of finance, and of politics. In politics, I'm thinking of the way we now conduct our affairs overseas. In education, there are changes. We need to be certain that these are not being made by the extreme right wing, which used to hide in people like Karl Marx. In religion, the perilous state of the Church of England needs to be examined for what it is there some kind of problem being caused for the Christian movement as a whole? I promise you that these are the areas that traditionally the banking elite will attack. What is happening in those sections, and can we get to the bottom of them? And we will get to the bottom of them, and we'll find that there's a common denominator in all the changes that occur in these areas. If we feel uncomfortable in our nation and find difficulties, it is simply because of the way these four things, finance, education, politics, religion, are being eroded at exactly the same moment. And so there's something that we can all do there to investigate and to support the nation that we once loved and still loved, but perhaps find difficulties within it at the current time.
I'd like to thank you very much for coming on the show. This has been a very, very interesting conversation, and I'm sure that all our listeners have really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you very much, Jen, and I certainly hope they will. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
If that interview has whetted your appetite, you might like to read William's book, which is called The Invisible College. Now, you can buy it either as a hard copy or as a downloadable ebook. If you go to our UK site, I have posted some information about the book that gives you a synopsis of all the chapters, all the information that's in it, and will also take you to Authors Online where you can purchase the book. Go to the homepage at Tax-Free 15, which is taxfree15.org.uk, and then just scroll down and find the posting dated the 13th of May, and there you'll find all the information. Well, I'm going to hand you back to the producers now, who are going to play a little bit of music to take us up to the top of the hour. I'd like to thank you all for joining us. And remember, the 15th is Don't Buy, Don't Comply, and Ask Why.